Welcome to Paradigms at paradigms.life. Hi, I'm Baruch, host of Paradigms. Thanks for tuning in. Paradigms exists to bring you inspiring people with visions of a viable future for life on Earth that includes humans. In this episode, we're meeting a person for whom creativity is his whole life. He's been playing instruments and writing and seeking out the unusual his whole life. He has a lot of great stories to tell, and in fact, this episode only contains excerpts from the interview because there was so much wonderful material. The interview in its entirety is available on the Paradigms website, paradigms.life, but we're going to hear excerpts from that interview and music from the new musical album he's just released with a wonderful group of musicians. So, let's hear some of those stories and some of that music now on this episode of Paradigms. John Kruth, welcome to Paradigms.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
You have this interesting project called the Folklorkestra.
Right. You got it the second time.
And you have a new record out called A Strange Day in June, and I listened to it this morning, and I really loved it. It's really fun to hear music that has no words, and you can really focus on the instruments and what is being said without words. But before we even get into the music and the records, and you've done so many things in your life. I mean, as a writer, as a musician, you've just done a ton of stuff. But we were just talking a little bit before we started the interview about your story. I would love to know more of your actual story from childhood. Like, how did you get into music? You just shared that with me. I'd love you to share it with listeners and all that stuff.
Well, my mom had a beautiful voice. It was just Mother's Day. So let's start with our mothers. My mother had a beautiful voice, and she would sing to me when I was a little kid. I remember Johnny as a bird, Joker, he's a bird, the Everly Brothers. And yeah, she had these funny songs that she learned at camp that she would sing. And my mother had a beautiful voice. I mean, she sang with the Larry Clinton Big Band in Newark for the USO for a short time before my father, who met her when she was singing, and her mother conspired to get her off the stage because, she was, as her friends called her later on in life, the Jewish Sophia Loren. She was kind of a hot number, and she was a singer, and that certainly shaped me for sure. I remember talking with Yusef Lateef, and he just was talking about the power of his mother's voice and how he always tried to recreate that with his flute and saxophone. So my mom had a beautiful voice and she would sing. And my father, he liked musicals. He would like walk around the house singing Men of La Mancha, singing to the record. He was a real cornball that way. And to Dean Martin records, he loved Dino. And Fiddler on the Roof, he loved If I Was a Rich Man. So there was music to a certain extent, but when it became kind of serious for me, I started getting a lot of resistance, particularly from my father, who was like, "No, you're not getting a drum kit," after I saw Ringo on Ed Sullivan. Because, Ringo was having more fun than anyone in the universe when you see that. And he's just smiling. And I never saw anybody having that much fun before. And I wanted to have fun like that. So I wanted a drum kit at first, and no, and I wasn't getting an electric guitar, and I wasn't, so all of that. I did get an acoustic guitar while I borrowed my friend's acoustic guitar by the time I was like 8 or 9, and learned Michael Row Your Boat Ashore and stuff like that. And then like when I heard Love Me Do, I had to get a harmonica, and I should have known better. Oh man, that just sent me flying down to Vito's Music, and I bought my first harmonica, and that really got me. And my sister had a groovy beatnik kind of boyfriend named Steve Brick, who was just turned me on to so many things, including the mandolin, which became a real passion for me. But he would come over to make out with my sister and would be carrying a lot of Atlantic jazz with him. And the thing that really stuck out to me was both at first Herbie Mann, hearing Herbie Mann, and I looked at him and I thought I might even look like that guy when I'm older. I just there was something I connected with him right away. And I wanted to go tea and I wanted to be a cool beatnik guy by the time I was like 8 or 9 or something. And so, like, I wanted a flute. And of course, my father thought I was a fairy, and because I wanted a flute, and everybody made fun of me because I wanted a flute. And my mother was like, okay, as long as you take some classical lessons, I'll get you a flute. So she got me the flute. I went to see this guy, Mr. Quinlan, who played in the Philharmonic Orchestra. And he became my teacher for a very short time because I don't know if I was teachable. I took a couple lessons and I couldn't read music. I still stumble through reading music, though half the band in the Folklorkestra reads, and we made charts up and all of that. But I went for lessons, and I heard Charles Lloyd playing Autumn Leaves. And I was completely, I mean, that just totally wiped me out. It was just one of the most beautiful things I'd ever heard. And I brought the record over and I said, I want to play just like this. And I put the record on for him and he said, no, you don't.
Oh
And
my
I,
goodness.
and I knew at that point that I was done with
Wow.
Mr. Quinlan. And then I heard Rahsaan Roland Kirk, who became the subject later on, years later, of my first book, Bright Moments. I heard Rahsaan Roland Kirk because Steve Brick brought over, I talked to the spirits, and I was like having this mystical experience listening to Serenade to a Cuckoo and all this stuff, and then all of a sudden, Tull came in and Traffic came in, and the flute was kind of cool in rock for a while, and I played harmonica and I played flute, and I didn't really have my own band. I mean, I've been like this all my life. I've sat in with other people's bands forever. There was a neighborhood band that I played with, the Visions of Mine, right? And I played flute with them and harmonica, and they were afraid to sing in front of the girls when the girls came over. And I was like, wait a man. If I sing in front of these girls, one of them's going to make out with me.
I'm talking with John Kruth about, among other things, his latest musical venture with the Folklorkestra and their new album, A Strange Day in June. We're going to hear some of that music now, and then we will pick up the conversation where we left off. Here's the title track, A Strange Day in June, from John Kruth and the Folklorkestra. This is Paradigms at paradigms.life. That's A Strange Day in June, the title track from the new record from the Folklorkestra. Now let's get back to my conversation with John Kruth. We're going to pick up where we left off. Here's John.
So that's kind of how I got into it. Though at the same point, I was really deeply into folk music, deeply. I mean, Sing Out Magazine was like some kind of Bible for me, and the civil rights movement and Bob Dylan singing, Hollis Brown. He lived on the outside of town and Masters of War. Those records just blew me away. I was just completely, but I didn't know if I could do it. I didn't know if I could do it. And I was still interested in art, very interested in art at the time. My mother was also a painter and took me to see a lot of great art at MoMA, at the Museum of Modern Art, or took me around to different, studios of artists that she knew in New Jersey. And so by the time I was 15 years old, I was becoming very disillusioned with rock. That's around 1970, even though I was going to the Fillmore and seeing great shows like Frank Zappa and Santana and Quicksilver and all these bands. I love the music, but I was becoming disillusioned with rock. I think part of it had to do with the folk politic. I was becoming more and more politically aware because it was the Vietnam War was escalating, and I was starting to read various things that my best friend Randy's brother was bringing home from Princeton because he was SDS. And so all of a sudden I'm getting turned on to Che Guevara and Bobby Seale, Eldridge Cleaver, Black Power, the whole thing. And I'm like thinking John Lennon's a jackass. He's driving around in a Rolls Royce. I'm like, and then Power to the People while driving around in a Rolls Royce. I'm like, what is this? So I was conflicted and I started listening to other music and like Thelonious Monk and Bartok and Ornette Coleman and all of a sudden boom, explosion. It wasn't just about a three-chord folk song or a three-chord rock and roll number anymore. Because I had the ears for it, I've never totally been able to write it out on paper, but I have the ears for it. I can hear it. I can hear stacked harmonies. And I developed beyond a lot of the people that I was playing with, who were all playing these 3 and 4 chord songs and stuff like that. And also was deeply inspired by Brian Jones, the Incredible String Band, Rahsaan, Roland, Kirk, Yusef Lateef, Eric Dolphy, all of these multi-instrumentalists who used sound as a palette, as color. And it was like all of a sudden, because I was interested in art, sound became color to me. It wasn't necessarily about notes. It was about how did Brian Jones use that dulcimer? How did he use that marimba? How did he use that sitar? And that, to me, for a while, was what the Rolling Stones were about. Is how Brian was going to shape these songs. I don't know how I got into this way. It was just instinct for me. It's always been about instinct. So that's how I got into it. But by the time I was like 18 or 19, I really had gotten into visual art. And I went off to school in Minneapolis at the Minneapolis College of Art and Design because I was number 50 in the Vietnam draft and I didn't register. I kept a bag packed in my apartment. And the school gave all the information to the draft board of who lived where and who was what age and all of that. They actually showed up at my door and told me, who do you think you're screwing around with here, buddy? Go register. And I still didn't register. And luckily, by like June of 73, 70, 74, it was all over. But I was like ready to, to flee to Canada, flight to
Yeah.
Canada, to get to Canada, to get out of the country, because there was no way I was going to carry a gun and I wasn't going to go protect the French, the Michelin rubber tire man,
Yeah.
because the French rubber plantations were being threatened. That's kind of where I was at. And then I wound up having an art school band called the Whirling Dervishes. And we wound up moving back to New York. And I played CBGB's and Max's Kansas City and realized you couldn't hear any of the lyrics. And started playing over at Folk City, and felt like it was kind of a folky dokey scene. It wasn't really that progressive or that interesting to me. A lot of people were just rehashing James Taylor and Jackson Brown and Bob Dylan and all of that. And I didn't hear anything very original happening. And one night, and I think that was 1983, the Violent Femmes came to Folk City. And a friend of mine said, "You got to see these guys, man. You're gonna really connect with them." And I went, and there were maybe, I don't know, 40 or 50 people in the joint, and they completely knocked me out. I mean, the energy and the intensity was, I'd only seen that with the Doors and maybe the Who. I had never seen it in a small place like that before. You just didn't know if a riot was going to break out. I mean, people could start fighting or in the room at any moment. It was just wild. And I walked up to Brian Ritchie and I said, "What are you listening to?" And he was like, Captain Beefheart, Nick Drake, Don Cherry. I said, "That's all the same stuff I'm listening to." He's like, "What do you do?" And I said, "I'm a multi-instrumentalist. I play this, that, and the other thing, because we're playing at Columbia University tomorrow night. Why don't you come up and sit in with us?" So I went and I sat in with them. It was great. And then Brian said, "Well, we're doing a tour of the East Coast. We're going to be up in Providence, Rhode Island, and then Boston, if you want to come along." And it was great. It was wild. It was like I had been around the rock and roll scene here and there, but I never saw some of the stuff I saw in those few short days at that point. And I had to go home. I was a married man. So that's kind of the start of all of it.
We'll be back with the next part of my conversation with John Kruth after we hear a pair of boleros from the new album A Strange Day in June from the Folklorkestra. A Pair of Boleros. And John tells us about that track extensively in the interview. Make sure you check out the whole interview at the Paradigms website, paradigms.life. Now let's get back to my conversation with John Kruth. You're listening to Paradigms at paradigms.life. I'm always looking for a message. What's the message, And that's easy when songs have words. When songs don't have words, when it's just the music,
Right.
it's not the same kind of intellectual thought message. It's a feeling spirit message more. So I'm interested in what y'all are doing. What are you doing?
Right. Yeah. Well, okay. I just have to tell you that I've had a dozen singer-songwriter albums out over the years under my own name. So I started out doing singer-songwriter, but always kind of bending the genre as much as possible, the way that Violent Femmes would use free jazz or different instrumentation and colors and stuff like that in their music. I was doing that too. And so that's why I connected with them so strongly. It wasn't necessarily about the coming of age songs that they were famous for, but the way that they approached musicality. And so that was very important to me. And a lot of my albums, people, thought were witty, whimsical, eclectic, whatever the words were, because Baruch, the whole history of rock and roll was about a synthesis of blending styles, of blending country with blues, with what they called rockabilly at first, to create something new, something fresh, something exciting. And I always felt two of my biggest heroes were Miles Davis and Bob Dylan, both Geminis like myself, who were not willing to just sit there and do the same thing over and over again, but were trying to find something new in the music, to create something new in the music, to create a new vocabulary and push the music forward somehow. So, of course, with Sun Ra, he would always tell you, or he would always say, ancient future. Same with the Art Ensemble of Chicago, ancient future. In order to know your future, you have to know your past. So you have to have your roots music down. This is what I tell all of my students. Learn how to play the blues, learn how to play an Appalachian fiddle tune, learn how to play learn what the scales are in klezmer music. Know what this stuff is so that you can use it as a vocabulary. So in the early 2000s, I was playing with Peter Stamfel for a while from the Holy Modal Rounders, and we were doing a lot of radical hillbilly kind of stuff because he plays fiddle and banjo and guitar, and I love the Rounders growing up, and we played for a couple of years, and he introduced me to this guy named Jeff Green, who was basically an instrument collector and really into the music in a big way. And he had a couple of my albums, and he wanted to make an album with me. And I was like, okay. So we went into the studio and we did this thing called Tribeca Stand. And Tribeca Stand came about because Bush came into office and we didn't really want to be Americans anymore. We were from Tribeca Stand. Tribeca, Jeff lived in Tribeca and I'm on Bleecker Street in the Village, and most of the musicians were from in and around this area. So we did Tribeca Stand for almost 8 or 9 years, and we split right before COVID, and I think we did a total of 6 albums and played all over the place, man. We played in Siberia, we played in Czech Republic, we played in Germany, we played in California, we played in Canada. We toured quite a bit with this band, and it got up to being at peak, I think it was 9 members. I had a 4-piece horn section at one point that included Matt Dario from the Klezmatics, and also a guy named Pramik Russell Tubbs, who had played with John McLaughlin and Santana. I had some incredible people in this band. COVID came, and it just wasn't time to get anything off the ground. And Jeff and I had sort of certainly had run our course, as a entity working together. One day I'm looking at Facebook and I see one of these ads for CMA, the Chamber Music of America, is giving a grant for new music in a chamber music mode. My friend Elliot Sharp, who you may or may not know, is a wonderful avant-garde guitarist and multi reed player and composer from New York City, says to me, Kruth, how are you going to get your next album out? There's no more record companies. You should write grants. You're a persuasive writer. You've got 6 books or whatever it was out at that point. You're a very persuasive writer. You should write grants. I see this ad from CMA, Chamber Music of America. They're giving a grant for new music. I'm like, what the hell? I'll apply for it. So I start applying for it. I don't want to get into it too deeply here, but I was really put off by some of the questions they were asking. They were all based on race and sexual preference and hardly asking stuff at all about your musical history, but more like they were trying to fill some quota of people of color, people of, different sexual orientation and all of that. And I'm like, screw this. I am not doing this. And my wife, Marilyn, says to me, you need practice filling out a grant form. Do this, do this. What the hell? Just do it. I did it. I sent it in. Right around that time, I had been scammed for $3,000 through Zelle. So I was not answering any email or phone call from anybody I did not know. And then my computer died. And I'm like, oh, what the hell? And I'm doing everything off the phone. And I get this message from Jose Feliciano. I'm looking at this and I'm like, is he even alive? A couple days go by, I get this message again from Jose Feliciano inviting me to $1,000 a plate fundraiser for CMA, for Chamber Music America. I'm like, yeah, right. And I'm in LA anyway. And I'm like, delete. A couple more days go by. John, we're trying to contact you. Please get back. Please get into. Long story short, I finally read the email and it sounds like I've won the grant.
We'll be back with the final part of my conversation with John Kruth after we hear this one from the Folklorkestra's new record, A Strange Day in June. It's called My Cousin the Spy. Cousin the Spy. That's the Folklorkestra from their new album, A Strange Day in June. And now here's the final part of my conversation with John Kruth. I'm interested in, you've got all this incredible life experience with music and incredible musicians and creativity and writing. And I mean, you've had a really amazing life. Looking at the world right now, I'm interested in what you see and what you see as possible for repair or healing or how we can make it better.
That's a really great question. And I think about that really often. Steve Ture, the wonderful trombone player who plays shells, he used to sit in with Tribeca. He was in Rahsaan Roland Kirk's band, and I became friends with him when I wrote the book on Roland Kirk, Bright Moments. And he used to say to me all the time, John, it's a lot harder to make a beautiful sound than it is to make an ugly sound. And he planted that one in me, which I really think comes through in Butterfly at 80 and The Girl I Never Knew and different spots on the album where beginning some of Madame Gonzo, where we're weaving flutes and stuff together. It's tricky because of the whole healing thing about music. I totally subscribe to and believe in. I don't I mean, I used to play sitar and flute in yoga classes quite a bit for a while. And I felt that that was a really kind of a beautiful thing to do. And I've played kirtan quite a bit. I'm friends with Radhanath Swami, who's a really beautiful, great kirtan singer and a spiritual teacher. And I think that all of those are really important. Sometimes it feels like you're preaching to the choir or to the people that can afford a $40 sound bath or a $60 sound bath when, well, many of us can't afford that. So it becomes a game, the healing game, as Van Morrison would call it. Yeah, there's battle lines being drawn, as Buffalo Springfield used to sing, right? And which side are you on, as the old folk song goes. Being 68 years old right now and dealing with the ups and downs of this heart dilemma, it's hard for me to be out there physically on the line, which I have been for many, many years, whether demonstrating or playing benefits. So I'm trying to bring some light to these very dark times in the only way that I know how, with my sense of humor in writing or with tonality. One of the reasons why I made an instrumental album was to try, I know this sounds really corny, but this is an album about the heart. I mean, it was all about the heart. It was all about Gaia and then me dealing with a heart condition, and trying to create music. You know what it is, Baruch, is that finally I started to, I mean, I think I did it at times with Tribeca, is to make the music that you want to hear, it takes years before you can actually just make the music that you want to hear or that you need to hear for yourself. Because if you're doing that for yourself, it's going to reach and touch other people. I really feel that there's some moments on this album that have a transcendental quality. So it's hard. I really don't know how to answer that question because I know that when I play live with either the illustrious ancestors on the West Coast, the Folklorkestra has yet to play live because this is very this has to be rehearsed. This is a different kind of music, and it has to be presented in a listening environment. I won't do it in a bar with this, with a cappuccino machine and somebody cooking burgers and fries. That's not this music. So we did it over in Italy, but not with a folk orchestra, but with some of the compositions. So I'm just trying to create music that I think Flaubert said it, that the prime objective is to keep one's soul aloft. And if this music can help in any way, shape, or form, do that, because it doesn't have to be a new agey thing to keep your soul off. The other day we were walking down 14th Street and all of a sudden I heard Chain of Fools, and Aretha just like, oh man, just took me right there, and I felt so much better just for hearing it. And it doesn't matter what it is when it strikes you, if it moves you, if it frees your mind so your ass can follow. But that's what I'm aiming for at this point. I don't know if songs with lyrics have always done that. I've always kind of gone for the joke or some kind of sarcastic thing here and there. In recent years, I think on Forever Ago, one of my most recent albums, I started to get beyond the shield, the armor, and let the heart come through.
Well, music does that. And whether it's new music or music from 1,000 years ago, when it touches us, it changes us in the moment, always. And it changes
Yeah,
us forever.
yeah,
And so, you know,
yeah,
I love it that you've taken, this entire life of experiences and creativity and just, your life, everything. What we're doing now is the culmination of what we've done so far. What we do in 10 years will then be that,
right,
so here you've
right.
brought all of this together in this music.
Yeah, and I've been so lucky to have like really great, I mean, I've sought out teachers or whatever, mentors or whatever you might call them over the years. So both Premik and I studied with Ornette Coleman. And people would say, "Oh, that's really crazy. Free jazz is whack," and da 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 da. He was so deeply into melody. One of the things we often worked on was Beautiful Dreamer by Stephen Foster. And that song really deeply, inspired something like A Butterfly at 80. That's what's behind that, is a transcendental, simple, lovely melody that's going to, like, lift you. And whenever I jam with Ornette, that was definitely one of the motifs that always came up. He loved to play Stephen Foster's Beautiful Dreamer. And we would play it rubato, and it would just be like, this kind of floating. So, I mean, I was really lucky to be around Hal Wilner and Joel Dorn and Ornette Coleman and Peter Stample, whoever these great people were that I got to work with, Sam Shepard, and it's all a learning experience and an odyssey.
It's really wonderful to talk with you about this, and you have had an amazing life, and I'll be curious to hear what happens next.
Well, thanks so much, Berto. Bright moments, as Roland Kirk would say, bright moments.
John, thank you for being on the show, and let's
Yeah,
stay in
keep
touch.
me posted.
John Kruth, I really enjoyed our conversation. You're such a great storyteller, and you've had so many amazing experiences. It was wonderful to have you share even just some of them with me and with listeners. I think when a person chooses to follow their creative path, when that asserts itself as the primary way of relating to the world, well, you just get all kinds of really interesting stuff, right? Like this music and all of the other stuff John has done, the books he's written, the music he's made. John, I think you're a great example of what happens when a human being just goes for it and follows their muses. Really appreciated talking with you and what you're doing. Thank you so much, John Kruth. And as I've said a couple of times, we only were able to play excerpts from the interview in this episode of Paradigms because John had so many great stories to tell. So I really encourage you to go to the Paradigms website, paradigms.life, and listen to the whole interview. And if you'd like to know more about John Kruth and the Folklorkestra, go to kruthworks.com, KRUTHWORKS.com. There's a lot there. And don't forget to check out A Pair of Boleros on YouTube. Fascinating and wonderful. And if you enjoyed this episode of Paradigms and you do visit the Paradigms website at paradigms.life, I hope you'll scroll down and click on the link to my new project, an audiobook, Khalil Gibran's The Prophet, narrated by Starhawk. I think you'll enjoy that also. Just talking with John and listening to him talk about his life and his experiences and the music and the creativity, well, it certainly gave me some juice in my own musical explorations and just that feeling of, oh, you can really let your creativity guide you. So I'm appreciating John Kruth and all of his creative endeavors. All right, well, I am going to leave you with one more track from the Folklorkestra, A Strange Day in June. It's called Meet Me in the Meadow. And let's let the word for the week be permission. Permission to be yourself. Permission to be creative. Permission to follow your inspirations. All right, this is Baruch signing off for this episode of Paradigms. We'll be back next time with more inspiring people. Until then, permission. Let's give ourselves permission to be ourselves and be well. You've been listening to Paradigms at paradigms.life.